Greetings, fellow traveller. Tired of the hardships of your journey? Here, take a seat by the fire and let me spin you a grim tale of a dark future where there is only war. Today I shall tell you about the Xenos menace known as the Necrons. Soulless skeletal automatons that have begun to rise from their 60 million year slumber to reclaim a galaxy that's rightfully theirs. We could basically summarise the Necrons as Egyptian Terminators from space. Granted, this is quite the exaggeration, but they do kind of look like T-800s with a heavy Egyptian aesthetic, style and even culture. I mean, their rulers literally hold the title of pharaohs, which is spelled slightly different, but it sounds very close to the mark. And if you need further convincing, the Necrons are kind of the 40k counterpart of Warhammer Fantasy's Tomb Kings, which are basically Egyptian undead skeletons and pharaohs. So yeah, the Necrons are kind of the same, but this time they're robots to make it more sci-fi friendly. But to fully understand this Xenos race of Egyptian undead spooky skeleton robots of the future, we need to go all the way back to the beginnings of the galaxy itself. More than 60 million years ago, the Old Ones rose as the first sentient life forms in the entire galaxy, and thus they were also the first to cross the space between stars and unravel the mysteries the galaxy had to offer. The Old Ones were notable for possessing immense psychic power, and it's speculated that eventually they reached the peak of their evolution, gaining very long lifespans that made them essentially immortal. In turn, their long lives would bestow them with vast amounts of experience, knowledge and wisdom. Little is known about this mysterious race apart from their semi-divine psychic powers. For example, their appearance is still up to debate. Some descriptions depict them as a cold-blooded race with scaled skin, in other words, reptiles. At first glance, the Slann from Warhammer Fantasy seem to fit the description. They are cold-blooded and possess great psychic power, although being basically frogs, they don't really have scales. On the other hand, the Slann once held the title of the Old Ones, although this part of the lore was retconned, and after they were merely made out to be one of the many servants of the Old Ones. And apparently this part of the lore is also true for Warhammer 40k. There are some descriptions that state that the Slann resemble the Old Ones. This is why many fans still believe the Old Ones could bear resemblance to massive frogs or toads wielding immense psychic power. The other theory says that the Old Ones were actually a catch-all term for several ancient races that aligned together, seeding life throughout the galaxy and colonizing many worlds. This second theory says little about their appearance, but seeing as they're described to be many different races, it would be quite a diverse alliance. Although the theory of the Old Ones being space frogs isn't confirmed, I'm personally quite fond of the idea of the mighty and mysterious precursor race that seeded life throughout the galaxy and unraveled the mysteries of the cosmos having such a humble appearance. Although even if they were giant magic space frogs, their humble appearance shouldn't fool you, for their greatest strength was their vast intellect and psychic power. The Old Ones studied astronomy and astrophysics, granting them insights into the nature of the cosmos, which eventually led them to the discovery of the warp. In these ancient times, the warp was a realm in balance, a dimension more akin to Plato's theory of forms, where ideas, thoughts and emotions can manifest. This allowed the Old Ones to manipulate the energies of the warp and unravel its secrets without any danger whatsoever. With the power of the warp and their psychic abilities, the Old Ones crafted true wonders, things that should only be possible in the wildest of dreams. For example, some ancient Eldar texts talk about an artifact made by the Old Ones that was able to make anything you could imagine. Now, just take a second to appreciate the mind-blowing possibilities of such an artifact. You could create, in an instant, anything your mind could conceive. Armour and weapons for 1 million soldiers, an entire fleet of warships, a new planet, or even an entire star system. And in the blink of an eye, it's there. With such an artifact, the possibilities are truly infinite, and this is only one example of the many wonders of Old One technology. One of their greatest creations that has in part survived until the 41st millennium is a great work of psychic engineering known as the Webway. A network of tunnels of gargantuan proportions located between the dimensions of the warp and reality, existing in a kind of threshold between the two. This grants the Webway certain aspects of both realms and allows ships travelling through it to achieve faster than light travel, therefore moving through the galaxy at greater speed than even through the warp. The Old Ones were so powerful that they acted as true gods of creation, shaping the galaxy to their will, seeding many worlds with life in their wake. Sometimes they'd leave nature to take its own course, and on other occasions they'd settle down on certain worlds to nurture their creations and guide them so they may grow and learn from their teachings. Why they favoured some of their creations that received their guidance and gifts, while others were left to face the hardships of the Darwinian path on their own, is a total mystery. Maybe they were simply mercurial, or perhaps they saw potential in some of their creations and they wished to exploit it, while others were merely experiments or sketches made before perfecting a certain design or formula. In any case, the Old Ones are responsible for populating a great part of the galaxy with their many creations. And why, you might ask? Well, the Old Ones viewed all life as sacred. They believed all life to be useful and valuable. They were also very aware of the great power and responsibility their actions held, and thus they took upon themselves the role of guardians and protectors of the galaxy, always striving for balance. It's believed that they had a policy of non-interference with the life that came about by itself, as to not break galactic balance, and I say it's believed to be this way because we don't really have a lot of information on how they interacted with other races that weren't their creations. Hell, we don't even have a lot of information about the Old Ones at all, although at least we can be sure that they were the first or one of the first races to ever achieve sentience and travel through the stars, seeding life and upbringing many of their creations. One of the races that came to be without the intervention of the Old Ones were the Necrontyr. Sounds pretty much like Necrons, right? Well, no spoilers yet, but I think we all know where this is going. While the Old Ones, and especially their creations, received the equivalent to the galactic lottery in terms of evolution, the Necrontyr, on the other hand, had a very bad hand dealt to them from the get-go. The race known as the Necrontyr emerged in a region of the galaxy known as the Halo Stars. One could argue that the Necrontyr were cursed from the very beginning, since the star of their system constantly bombarded their planet with solar winds and storms, irradiating the Necrontyr's homeworld and any forms of life upon it. Apart from turning their homeworld into a radiated, inhospitable rock, the intense radiation was devastating for the Necrontyr as well. As a consequence, they had short lifespans, cancers and disease spread through their bodies, and they suffered agonizing pain throughout their entire lives. Their short lifespan led their culture to be quite grim indeed, centered around the worship of death, accepting it as an inevitable fact and an inseparable part of life. Thus, their cities were built as great necropolis, filled with tombs and sepulchres, where the living were seen as mere temporary residents who would very soon meet their ancestors. Born knowing your life will be short, painful and full of disease would be enough to discourage anyone. Alas, far from falling to despair, the Necrons redoubled their efforts to escape from their system and get as far away as possible from that damned star that was the bane of their existence. With this goal, they began developing their technology at high speed, surprisingly fast for a race with such short lifespans, although this drive was due to the Necrontyr philosophy of making the most of their lives, not in the carpe diem sense, but rather doing the most they could with the time they had, achieving the greatest milestones possible to leave a great legacy behind them when they were finally gone, so that they could be remembered for their deeds and accomplishments. This philosophy inevitably led them to an individualistic, ambitious, and selfish mentality that would drive them to always work towards their own interests. The Necrontyr were ruled by a series of different dynasties, which in turn were ruled by the Triarch. The Triarch is made up by 3 pharaohs, and the leader of these 3 had the title of the Silent King. As the title suggests, instead of directly addressing his subjects, he'd always talk through the other 2 members of the Triarch that acted as the Silent King's mouthpieces. Therefore, the Silent King was a de facto ruler of the entire Necrontyr race, and apart from all the responsibilities tied to the title of ruler, the Silent King had to maintain unity and stability between the different dynasties, which was no easy task at all, since each dynasty strived for their independent goals, always searching for glory and riches for their great legacy, which more often than not would lead them to war with one another. The title of the Silent King was supposed to be hereditary, and so one would think it would always stay inside the same dynasty. But the Necrontyr's short lives made it so the title would pass through different dynasties throughout their history. To finally escape the 6th star that blighted them, they built great starships with engines that allowed them to move at a fraction of the speed of light. Since they had no knowledge of the warp, this was the fastest means of travel they had at their disposal to cross the vast interstellar void. In order to survive their thousands upon thousands of years of travel, they would equip their ships with stasis fields, similar to cryogenic pods we see in other sci-fi settings, but instead of freezing you, stasis fields slow down the flow of time down to such a degree that the seconds are stretched into what seems like an eternity, making time practically freeze. With this kind of technology, you could spend thousands of years in stasis and wake up the next day with no issues whatsoever. This kind of technology allowed the Necrons to start spreading throughout the galaxy, assembling colonies in search of a new home, free from the maligned star of their home system and hopefully free of disease. Their technology would advance at the same pace they expanded their territory. Their most iconic piece of tech is probably their Gauss weaponry that splits a target's molecular bonds, stripping them down atom by atom, and with such fierce weaponry, few other races could stand against them. Alas, to their sorrow, the Necrontyr eventually learned that no matter how much their technology advanced or how far away they got from their 6th star, they were unable to cure their disease. The radiation of their homeworld star had corrupted their very DNA, and the damage was completely irreparable. To be fair, if you were a Necrontyr, you too would probably be cursing that goddamn star that literally gave you and your entire race cancer and eternal suffering. And I'm not 100% sure, but I'm quite confident it was a common Necrontyr practice in which they would engage several times a day. During their growing expansion, the Necrontyr eventually came into contact with the Old Ones, finding that they already claimed and colonized most of the fertile worlds in the galaxy, leaving only the scraps for the Necrontyr. Albeit, the Necrontyr were completely fascinated by the secrets of life and immortality the Old Ones held. Desperate, they asked them to share their knowledge with them so they too could become immortal and finally be free from the curse of disease they were born with. Alas, the Old Ones didn't wish to interfere with the Necrontyr's destiny, and decided that nature should follow its course. This refusal by the Old Ones is probably what started everything. The whole reason why the galaxy is plunged in war, darkness, and horrors from other dimensions in the 41st millennium. Quite possibly, it could all have been avoided if only they heeded the Necrontyr's pleas for help. And who knows, maybe the galaxy would have turned out to be a completely different place, full of light, balance, and peace. But to be fair, I don't really blame the Old Ones for their decision, because granting immortality to a race of death worshippers with advanced technology capable of stripping their enemies down to their constituent atoms that started a campaign of galactic conquest, destroying and enslaving many other races in their wake, well, probably isn't the best idea in the galaxy, especially when you view life as sacred. The Necrontyr, jealous and now resentful towards the Old Ones for not sharing their toys with them, started to harbour a deep hate for the Old Ones that extended throughout their empire until every single Necrontyr despised the Old Ones with all their being. The Necrontyr had built a great galactic empire, but the suffering of their eternal sickness and the hate they felt towards other races and towards their own fate, plus the fact that they weren't many more territories they could claim, undermined Necrontyr unity, and very soon different dynasties started fighting for power, influence, territory, glory for their legacies, and some of them even sought to gain independence from the Triarch to establish their own personal kingdoms. All this infighting grew up into a point that it turned into the First War of Secession, a great Necrontyr civil war that threatened to destroy everything they had accomplished. The Silent King would have these rebels crushed under his boot if he could, but his hands were tied, for when his forces would arrive at the site of an uprising, it would have ended long before his armies arrived, and the rebellious dynasties would have had time enough to ready and prepare defences in order to repel the Triarch's response. Faced with the prospect of losing everything they'd achieved, the Triarch had to find a new way to unify the Necrontyr under a singular purpose, a legitimate cause that all Necrontyr would see as a necessity. And what better way to unify your people than with a war against a common enemy? Although it couldn't be just any enemy, it had to be something that posed a threat to their empire, a big enough threat to justify the need to unify under a singular banner. And the Triarch had just the perfect target in mind. A civilization that ticked all the boxes, and wouldn't you know it, the Necrontyr already hated them to their bones. So it wouldn't take much to get all the different dynasties on board. You guessed it, the Old Ones. After hearing the Triarch's proposition, the different Necrontyr dynasties, ecstatic to gain revenge on the Old Ones for not sharing their technologies that could cure them once and for all, joined the cause with passion. And in any case, what damage could a civilization of Pacific, balance-seeking space frogs really do? Right? And so, with a declaration of war against the Old Ones, the war in heaven began. Some say that the events and conflicts that took place during the war in heaven could fill entire libraries, unending numbers of campaigns and battles throughout thousands of years. Some sources go as far as stating that the war in heaven lasted 5 million years. Whichever the case, it was such a catastrophic war, it would scar the galaxy forever. Although outnumbering the Old Ones and having technology more than capable of rivaling theirs, the Necrontyr were defeated time and time again because of simple and plain logistics. Mainly, the speed at which they could deploy their armies. You see, the Old Ones and the races that fought with them weren't bound by the material realm. They could travel through the webway from one corner of the galaxy to another at astonishing speeds, while the Necrontyr on the other hand had to travel through space in slow sublight ships. Slowly but surely, the Old Ones reduced the Necrontyr Empire to a handful of worlds in the region of the Halo stars from which they hailed. After so much hard work and fighting, the Necrontyr were right where they began, all the way back next to their sickening star and nowhere closer to a cure for their afflictions. On the bright side for the Necrontyr, at least the Old Ones hadn't decided to completely eradicate them, since, as we know by now, they hold all life forms to be sacred and deserving to exist. And on the other hand, they had already crushed their empire, decimated their armies, and isolated them to a small region of space. For all intents and purposes, the Necrontyr were no longer a threat, and thus the Old Ones decided to let them live in peace, hoping the Necrontyr had learned their lesson. The Necrontyr, outraged by the outcome of the war, turned on one another yet again, causing the Second War of Secession, where the dynasties battled for the little power that was left. Once again, the Triarch saw the Necrontyr facing the abyss. The war against the Old Ones had been a complete disaster, and on top of that, tensions had led to yet another civil war. It was at this moment in time when the Necrontyr on their homeworld made a discovery that would change their fates forever. They had discovered a new life form, a kind of intelligent gas cloud that was feeding off their local star. This was the first time the Necrontyr encountered what would later be known as the C'tan. The C'tan are ethereal beings of pure energy, incalculable power, and insatiable hunger that were born at the beginning of time in the miasma of energy unleashed by the Big Bang. They are arguably the oldest beings in the universe, and their only motivation is the consumption of energy. During the beginnings of the universe, there were vast amounts of energy to consume, although as the energy dispersed, the C'tan would seek their food wherever they could find it, and the best source turned out to be stars. Therefore, they would stick to stars like parasites and slowly suck away their energy. This is why some have dubbed the C'tan as the star vampires, flying from one star system to another to consume its star's energy until it's vanished, moving on to the next and repeating the process anew. However, the C'tan's perception was quite limited indeed. They were completely blind to all other races and sentient life that populated the cosmos, happy to carry on with their star-based diet until the end of time. However, all this changed when the Necrontyr decided to begin communicating with the C'tan, known as the Nightbringer. At first, communications were complicated since the C'tan couldn't perceive the world as mortals do, and thus they struggled to communicate with the Necrontyr. It would be, for example, like cockroaches trying to speak to Stephen Hawking. Damn difficult if you ask me. Although the Nightbringer, till now ignorant of the feelings of sentient life forms, started to develop a certain appetite for the suffering and hate that emanated from these small cockroaches that were trying to reach him, and so he would listen to what they had to say, while he would tell other C'tan that he might have found a much tastier feast than solar energy. Zarek, the Silent King at the time, ordered the construction of bodies made of a living metal known as necrodermis that could contain the powerful essence of the C'tan as to communicate with them face to face. This necrodermis is a special kind of metal capable of auto-repairing all damage, flowing like a liquid to fill up holes, cuts, dents, and even repairing dismemberment. To give you an example, if you're old enough to get it, it's a bit like the stuff the Terminators from Terminator 2 and 3 were made out of, and if you're too young for that, we'll just think of it as a special kind of magical metal that just auto repairs all damage. With their new and shiny bodies, the C'tan saw the world with new eyes. They had been introduced for the first time to the world of the living, ripe with emotions and feelings. Soon the C'tan came to understand that killing with their own hands and consuming living beings' souls was much more nutritious than feeding off stars. Even more succulent still was making living beings suffer and feed off their agony and suffering before killing them. One would suppose this is something the C'tan discovered away from the prying eyes of the Necrontyr. I mean, it's not like the C'tan would find out just by rampaging through the streets of the Necrontyr homeworld or something like that. Or maybe it was something they could just tell intuitively through their godlike senses. In any case, the C'tan listened to the tragedy of the Necrontyr, their afflictions, and their disastrous war against the Old Ones. After hearing about it all, they sent a spokesman to the Triarch known as Mefret Ran to make them an offer. Mefret Ran told them everything they wanted to hear. Not only did the C'tan offer the cure to the Necrontyr and the blessing of immortality with their powers, but they revealed that they were also enemies of the Old Ones, having been defeated at their hands long ago and reduced to their gas-like bodies that fed off stars. In exchange for immortality, they only asked the Necrontyr for vengeance against the Old Ones that had caused them so much harm. Now, in all fairness, this last thing about being defeated by the Old Ones kind of sounds like too convenient, and in my opinion is a load of bull, especially when we take into account that the C'tan Mefret Ran would later be known as the Deceiver, but we'll get to that in a moment. The way I see it, the C'tan hadn't encountered the Old Ones yet. We don't have any lore referencing to them meeting prior to the war in heaven, and in my opinion, this was one of the many deceptions of the Deceiver. On the other hand, I will grant the Deceiver that the Catan and the Old Ones could be conceived as natural enemies somehow. The Old Ones could be seen as the guardians of life, and the Catan could be conceived as the destroyers. I could even go along to concede that maybe they were aware of each other at some primordial instinctual level, even if they weren't very sure what they were sensing. Another theory holds that the Old Ones had found the Catan long ago, but seeing that they were harmless creatures that drained stars very little by little, they decided to leave them be. But honestly, in my opinion, it's more probable that the Catan licked their lips with anticipation when they heard the Necrontyr describe the Old Ones, wondering just how tasteful such powerful beings' souls would be. Getting back to the Necrontyr, Zarek couldn't believe it. The answer to all his prayers, a cure to the sickness that had plagued them from their very origins, and a sweet vengeance against the Old Ones, all wrapped up and delivered at his doorstep. It was almost too good to be true, so good that it was suspicious. And so, the Triarch took an entire year debating how to answer the Catan's offering. During this time of indecision, the Necrontyr came to worship the Catan as gods, gathering in different cults that appeared all through their race. And to be fair, with the wondrous promises and great magical powers the Catan manifested, it's no wonder they saw them as divine. Even the name Catan they used for these entities was a Necrontyr word that literally means star god. The magical powers of the Catan seemed to have no limits, and quite possibly helped to empower Necrontyr technology to astounding new levels. Zarek thought it over and over again, but he seemed to be at a dead end. On the one hand, the Catan's offer seemed too good to be true. There had to be some kind of strings attached. But on the other, if he refused, the dynasties would surely rebel against him again in a third war of secession, and everything would come crumbling down. Seeing no other viable options, after a year of pondering, the Triarch finally accepted the Catan's offer. The Catan then provided the Necrontyr with their secret knowledge, and the Biotransference process began. Illuminor Zeras, a revered cryptic technomancer, was the one who engineered the process with the knowledge given by the Catan. Soon, great soul forges were erected where the Necrontyr would abandon their disease-ridden bodies, transferring their consciousnesses into new shiny bodies of necrodermis. And so every single Necrontyr marched into the soul forges to undergo the biotransference, emerging on the other side with immortal and almost indestructible new bodies that could repair all damage dealt to them. When Zarek finally emerged from the forge in his new and powerful form, he saw it had worked. He no longer felt pain. For the first time, he could think clearly without the storm of agony that blinded his senses. His race was cured. He had achieved his ancestors' dream. So many thousands of years of suffering had finally paid off. Zarek felt... he felt... nothing. Nothing at all. Thus, the Deceiver's trick was finally revealed. The Catan had betrayed them in the most vile and cruel way possible. Their new immortal bodies had cost them their very souls. We don't actually know what happened in the soul forges during the biotransference, but we can guess it involved a bit of space voodoo, red hot metal, pain, and that slight tickle one feels when their soul is torn from their body and consumed by the star gods. The Necrontyr were reduced to hollow metal shells, soulless wretches that couldn't feel anything at all. Most even lost their wills and awareness completely, turned into cold machines, simple automatons. They had completely lost the spark of life, and from now on, they would be known as the Necrons. Zarek also noticed another change in his new body. A command protocol had been installed in his new form with which he could control his subjects with his very thoughts. All Necrons would now obey his commands to the letter. so apart from immortality, the Necrons had been gifted unity. No longer would upstart dynasties rebel against him or squabble for power, now they were enslaved to his will. Despite losing their souls and wills, their consciousness lingered, acting as a kind of AI or software that allowed them to control their metallic bodies to a certain extent. Given the C'tan's twisted sense of humour, it could be the case that they allowed their awareness to remain without them being able to control their bodies, forcing them to watch their new existence for all eternity. And a more sadistic touch even would be to leave the pain button on for the entire process. That would have been truly cruel indeed. Imagine being imprisoned in your own mind, forced to see the monster you've become, destroying everything in your wake, and feeling every wound, every cut, every dent or impact. And on top of that, they would suffer the psychological pain of knowing of the C'tan's cruel betrayal and not being able to do anything about it. That would be a truly horrible destiny and a very fitting one for 40k. Although unfortunately this is pure speculation and wild theorizing, since the lore clearly states that they basically have no self-awareness and feel nothing. Although this isn't completely true for all Necrons, it varies depending on their rank. Those with the strongest wills could cling on to their awareness and identities during the Biotransference, coming out on the other side with complete consciousness and emotions. To give you a broad picture of the different degrees of their awareness, the standard Necron, aka the Necron Warrior, would have the equivalent intelligence of a smartphone or NPC, being able to process information and react to certain stimuli. The Immortals, on the other hand, retain a bit more of their awareness and an echo of their intelligence, granting them a further depth of reaction than Necron Warriors. They also retained most of their tactical and strategical experience and are capable of simple emotionless speech to report to their superiors. Their limited intelligence won't allow them to learn and adapt to circumstances on the battlefield, however it does give them independence to carry out the strategies they see fit to achieve victory, and they can even issue orders to Necron Warriors if needed. The Lich Guard are basically the elite bodyguards of Necron nobility, therefore their necrodermis is of higher quality and their personalities and intellect were preserved during the Biotransference, although they are completely incapable of disobedience and obey every single command of their masters, the Necron Lords. Most Necron Lords or Necron Nobles also retain their minds and personalities. Usually they lead great armies and rule over entire tomb worlds. These, in turn, serve the Necron Overlords, who also possess plain consciousness and emotion, ruling over several Necron Lords and even entire dynasties. These Necron Overlords that rule over entire dynasties usually possess the rank of Pharaon. The Overlords, and especially Pharaons, only answer to the Triarch and the Silent King, to whom they were now enslaved through the protocols of their new robotic bodies. So basically, the higher up in the rank a Necron goes, the more intellect, personality and consciousness they will have retained from the Biotransference. This new way of ruling over his servants was indeed effective, although it didn't change the fact that it was a cruel kind of slavery. They had been deceived by the C'tan with their sweet promises, and now they were paying the price for immortality. This vile treason made the few self-aware Necrons turn their faith and trust in their new gods into profound hatred and pain. Alas, for all the spite and rage Zarek felt, he had to keep his side of the bargain. The Necrons were immortal, yes, but how could they defy these supernatural soul-devouring beings with godlike powers? Seeing himself out of options, when the C'tan called the Necrons to war against the Old Ones, Zarek had to accept. And thus, the war in heaven entered its second chapter. The Necrons came back from the ashes, and this time, apart from their shiny new frames, they brought horrifying reinforcements. This new phase in the war in heaven was devastating for the Old Ones and their creations, as the Necrons were both empowered and reinforced by their new C'tan gods, who on the battlefield were true forces of mass destruction. It's even said that the most powerful among them could consume the life of entire planets and star systems in one fell swoop. Aside from the devastation caused by the C'tan, the Necrons brought a whole new set of tricks up their sleeve. Their new living metal bodies made them almost indestructible thanks to their self-repairing qualities, and even in the event of critical damage, they are teleported back to the nearest tomb world to be repaired, and even if disintegrated, what passes for their consciousness is reintroduced into another metal body at a nearby facility. The C'tan had kept their word. For all practical purposes, they were truly immortal. If this weren't enough, their technology, at the time one of the most advanced in the galaxy, was boosted by the eldritch powers of the C'tan to unimaginable heights. Whereas before they were already capable of exploding a star at the push of a single button and break down their victims atom by atom with their Gauss weaponry, now they were able to manipulate parallel dimensions. These dimensions, however, are not like warp space, which is anathema to reality, but are rather other dimensions of the physical world, other faces of reality that can't be perceived through traditional perception. The use of these parallel dimensions opened a new range of possibilities for the Necrons that we can only describe as cheating. Their new tricks included phase changes, dividing their body into two dimensions to avoid any damage, or going through obstacles like a ghost. Artifacts known as Tesseract Crypts that are capable of creating pocket dimensions to trap their enemies in a dimensional labyrinth, where its user would literally be a god controlling all its parameters. On top of that, they had also mastered the power of teleportation to perfection, stepping from the other side of the battlefield through the fourth dimension and appearing behind you to stab you in the back. Another big improvement was that now their ships could teleport from one system to another instantaneously through what is referred to as phasing. Therefore, they could match the speed and response times of the old ones. They had also developed inertialess drives that made their ships immune to inertia, so their ships could travel faster than light without receiving any damage. Another great technological breakthrough came when the C'tan known as the Burning One helped the Necrons build Dolmen Gates, living stone portals with which the Necrons could access the Old One's webway and use it to their advantage, turning the mightiest weapon of the Old Ones against them. Thanks to all these new technologies and the power of their new C'tan masters, they began to win battle after battle, conquering system after system, extinguishing entire races so that their souls would be devoured by the C'tans, or enslaving them so that they could carry out their twisted wills. Now, on a side note, the specifics of this technology boost I'm mentioning is mostly my own speculation. The lore only states that their technology was improved by the C'tan, but it doesn't go much into detail apart from the Dolmen Gates. So basically I'm trying to make an educated guess as to what tech they had before and how much it was improved thanks to the C'tan. For example, I'm assuming they didn't have access to dimensional tech, or they weren't able to phase their ships from one system to another, because if they had this before the C'tan came, they might have stood a better chance against the Old Ones. Back to the war in heaven, the unrelenting Necron advance devastated the entire galaxy. The power of their new masters increased with each massacre, to the point that the Old Ones had to retreat to their safest strongholds and even seek refuge in the webway to devise a plan to avoid extinction. Desperate to find a way to fight back, they turned to the warp and their talent for creating life, engineering new races with psychic powers to manipulate the energies of the warp in order to fight the C'tan and their eldritch power. Foremost amongst these new creations were the Canib, the Roshan and the Eldar, although only the Eldar would survive until M41. These new races were tutored and guided by the Old Ones in the secrets of life and the warp, and prepared to fight in the war for the survival of the galaxy. Thanks to these teachings, they began to use the warp to create their own entities, creating a whole pantheon of gods that could stand up to the C'tan and buy time for the Old Ones. The energies of the warp and the warp entities wielded by the Old Ones' new creations were completely opposed to the powers of the C'tan, and it seemed that the war was once again turning in their favour. The C'tan, furious that the Old Ones were also using hacks, ordered the Necrons to build black stone pylons, a material that, under the right circumstances, is capable of nullifying the energies of the warp. They built several of these artifacts on worlds throughout the entire galaxy, which connected with each other to create patterns of space free from warp energy. Although the C'tan wouldn't have to finish their project, as the Old Ones were about to face the consequences of using the powers of the warp without restraint. The warp, which until now was a realm in harmony, began to lose balance with all the flow of souls and negative emotions of hatred, suffering, and fear that the war in heaven was generating, taking the first steps to turning into the hellish and twisted realm that we see in M41. All of these negative emotions began to coalesce until they gained a consciousness of their own, forming the first ever warp predators, known as the Enslavers. These beings exist partially between reality and the warp, so we can't define them as demons per se, but like them, they are attracted to psychers, feeding on their minds with their foul tentacles and creating portals to the warp through which the proper demons would appear. Also, as you might imagine by their names, the Enslavers could end up enslaving entire planets' populations to their wills. The Enslavers spread across the galaxy, feeding on the Old Ones and the psychic races they had created in a devastating feast of souls. The C'tan, despite consuming souls, did not possess souls of their own, and their Necron slaves had been robbed of theirs long ago, so they were completely immune to this new warp plague ravaging the galaxy. Although they weren't immune to the nefarious energies and demons pouring out of warp portals all over the galaxy, so they would close them with their blackstone pylons wherever they found them. In these desperate times, the Old Ones once again sowed more life in a last effort to stop their enemies. This time their creations turned out to be more crude and aggressive, since they really didn't have much time to design them. The clearest example were the muscular and ultra-violent Krork that are thought to later evolve into the Orcs that populate the galaxy of M41. Despite completing their science project quickly and poorly 5 minutes before the deadline, the Old Ones could not stop the C'tan and the Enslavers at the same time. This turned out to be the straw that broke the camel's back for the Old Ones. They were massacred until only one was left. There are several theories about the last Old One's whereabouts. Some say he sought refuge in the depths of the warp, others say he hid throughout the galaxy to survive in secret and died at the birth of Slaanesh. Others say he abandoned the galaxy altogether, and although some speculate that he's in hiding, hatching a plan to defeat the C'tan once and for all and re-establish balance, it's only pure speculation, and the Old Ones were never seen again. As life in the galaxy became extinct, the C'tan saw that they would soon run out of food. Panicking, they began to turn on each other in acts of pure cannibalism, a desperate fight for energy. It seems that no one taught them to ration and store food, and that if you eat all the food in the goddamn galaxy, well, there is no more food. This internal strife decimated their numbers until only a few accumulated all the energy they had harvested as a group. Sorek had realised that the war against the Old Ones would soon be over, and if he wanted revenge on the hated C'tan, he had to take his chances sooner than later, and this C'tan civil war was the perfect opportunity. The Necrons turned against their Dark C'tan masters in another great war of their own. The task of killing eldritch beings of pure energy and unlimited power sounds impossible, and indeed it was, so the Necrons came up with very creative tricks to finish them off. It turned out that if they applied enough destructive force, they could shatter the C'tan into different shards that only retained a part of their power. These fragments would later be captured in the Tesseract labyrinths we mentioned earlier, which would enclose the C'tan fragments in a labyrinth inside a pocket dimension from which they couldn't escape. In this way, the Necrons managed to turn the tables and use the Necrons as power sources, weapons, or literally as Pokemon. No, I'm not kidding. They could unleash them from their prisons in the heat of battle to destroy their enemies, and then return to the Tesseract Labyrinth, until the C'tan was needed again. I know it sounds simple in principle, but in reality, defeating the Catan took a great effort, for the Necrons lost many forces trying to get rid of their masters. In some very isolated cases, they could completely destroy the Catan with their powerful weaponry, although we only know of one such a case, that of Landu Gor the Flayer, who, upon death, cursed his executioners with his last breath, with a curse that took time to manifest but proved to be truly terrifying, known as the Flayer virus. If you wish to know more about the Flayer virus, I have a video on the subject, so if you want to know more, do go and check it out. Having finally rid themselves of their Catan masters and finished off their arch-enemies, the Old Ones, the Necrons were exhausted and drained of strength. They had been fighting for countless millennia, and the galaxy was in tatters and deeply scarred by the war in heaven. Most life was extinct, and warp tears all around were spewing horrors through cracks in the fabric of reality. Also, the Eldar, or Eldari, who had survived the galactic apocalypse, were a young race ripe with potential and energy that was already beginning to seed its own empire across the stars. Despite having achieved victory against the Old Ones and the Catan, Zarek could not stop longing for his flesh and blood. He wanted to repair the terrible mistake he had made and the tragic fate he had led his people to, although he didn't know how, nor if it was even possible. But if it was, he knew he would need new flesh bodies that met his standards. In the absence of worthy candidates, and facing the rise of the Eldar Empire, Zarek sent all the Necrons to their tomb worlds to slumber until he could find a remedy, or until the galaxy generated life anew, and a candidate for a new biotransference would emerge. This Necron exodus is known as the Great Sleep, that would last enough for life to flourish anew in the galaxy. The Silent King, regretting his terrible mistake, destroyed the command protocol that the Catans had gifted him to free the Necrons from his yoke, and went into exile, leaving the galaxy in a kind of penance without ceasing to seek a remedy for his people in the meantime. And so, the Necrons marched into their great sleep. But when do you think Zarek set the alarm for? How long does it take for life to grow again throughout the galaxy? Well, according to Zarek, 60 million years. It could be that Zarek simply said screw it and set 60 million years just to be sure, or on the other hand it could be that he chose another exorbitant amount and the stasis crypts simply aren't designed to work for such a long time, and the reason why the Necrons are waking up 60 million years after is because they're beginning to malfunction. In any case, 60 million years later, in the 41st millennium, the Necrons have awakened from the Great Sleep. Although something seems to have gone wrong, instead of awakening all at once in a unified manner, which would be ideal for the Necrons and disastrous for the galaxy, they seem to be awakening bit by bit, a solitary tomb or an isolated tomb world at a time. Some tombs awaken completely on their own, while others are discovered by unfortunate treasure hunters whose curiosity doomed them. The pharaohs of each dynasty, free from the command protocols, have begun to pursue their own interests, and the different personalities of the Necron leaders make the dynasties behave very, very differently. Some woke up with the purpose of reconquering their territories, seeing that their worlds have been occupied by new forms of life that need to be eradicated. Others returned to seek glory and achievements for their legacy, conquering without mercy, and some are even peaceful as long as their territory is respected, and even go as far as to trade with other races. Like for instance, Trazyn the Infinite, also known as the Collector, because he literally collects all kinds of artifacts and living beings that catch his attention in his great museum. This particularly eccentric Necron lord even seems to be aiding Belisarius Cawl in his research on Blackstone. So, as I say, not all Necrons are completely hostile. The most unfortunate Necron lords were damaged during the very long time they had been frozen in stasis and ended up losing their minds, left only with their eternal hatred towards all forms of life, and won't stop until they annihilate every last atom of organic matter. Some dynasties, realizing they were no longer under the yoke of the command protocol and their silent king was absent, sought to gain power at any cost, often warring with other dynasties to gain territory or influence. In fact, Necron infighting is probably their main weakness. If all the dynasties were unified under a singular purpose, they would pose a much more terrifying threat to the galaxy. This was the current state of the Necrons in M41 until the return of the Silent King, who surprisingly arrived back to the galaxy after his long exile. Most say it's due to the threat of the Tyranids. It's said that he was the first to see them in the intergalactic void and turned back because he knew that if the Tyranids came to the galaxy, they would be able to consume and extinguish all life forms that had arisen, again taking away the possibility of retransferring Necron consciousnesses to new bodies. Others pose that the Silent King has returned to close the great warp rift that splits the galaxy in two. What we can say for certain is that if the Silent King has returned, it will be to try to change the fate of his race and reconquer the galaxy that's rightfully theirs. The return of the Silent King could herald Necron unity once again. If the dynasties decide to follow his leadership once again, they may very well achieve galactic domination. These are the Necrons, soulless, immortal, undead monstrosities coated in bodies of living metal, the first to plunge the galaxy into darkness, driving the old ones to extinction and destroying their own gods. They are undoubtedly one of the greatest Xenos threats to the Imperium. Their technology is quite possibly the most advanced in the entire galaxy, and their numbers are legion. There you have it, the tragic story of the Necrons, a race that gave everything to achieve immortality and now seeks to be free of their cursed existence. At some point I'll make videos covering the different dynasties and key characters of the Necrons, like Transin the Infinite for example, but for now I'm counting the Necrons and the history of the beginning of the galaxy as covered, and I'm going to continue with the next race in chronological order in my next video about the Eldar and the fall of their great empire. Anyway, that's all from me for now. If you enjoyed the video, you know the drill. Leave a like and subscribe for more content. Thanks for watching, and hopefully we'll meet again in the next video.